Uh, welcome to Apem's Managing Terrestrial Invasive Non-Native Species in the UK, lessons learned from other island nations. Just to go through a few housekeeping points to begin with. We'll be keeping you on mute and cameras off during the webinar. Please feel free to use the question facility throughout the webinar. However, we will review and answer these at the end of the webinar. The recording will be ready to share with you on Wednesday, the 9th of October, and you will receive a notification by email. Please feel free to share the recording and to also reach out if there are any particular topics you want us to talk about in the future, and we'll do our best to find a speaker and to cover it for you. Moving on. So just to introduce our speakers today, Sarah, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. My name's Sarah. I'm a senior non-native species consultant with Apem. Previously, I've got experience working with a range of non-native species, from American mink to plants. So I've been with Apem for about 8 months now. So hopefully you'll find this interesting. Paul.
Thanks, Sarah. So my name is Paul Stubbing. I'm an associate director and I'm the leader of the invasive non-native species team within Apem. Basically, as way of a brief coverage of the team, we cover terrestrial, marine, invasive, and freshwater invasive species. We take a holistic approach to invasive species management, covering risk assessment, monitoring, surveillance, biosecurity, control and eradication. So we cover everything from the more theoretical side through to the practical side as well. So just to cover content of what we're going to deal today, I'll talk a little bit about who Apem are. I'll provide a brief summary of what invasive species are, some information on invasive species in the UK, handing over to Sarah for a potted history of introductions, 7 key lessons, some successful examples of work done in the UK, and then summary. But also we've included references, and then we'll pass over to questions at the end. So moving on, just to cover a very brief summary of who Apem is for those who don't know. So Apem are a global environmental consultancy providing independent advice and guidance covering all areas of the natural environment. We combine expert independent advice with technology and world-class laboratory services to provide the advice for our clients. The Apem group consists of Apem, Apem Inc., Aquafact, Gobi and Woodrow, all who've recently joined us. We bring together this global expertise and technology and innovation to service our clients' requirements. So moving on to what are invasive species. So I'm sure many of you on the call are already aware of this, but just to cover it for those who don't know. So non-native species are also known as non-indigenous, alien or exotic. A species that have been, or parts of species, so propagules, eggs and fragments that have been moved from outside of their native range as a result of human actions. So, for example, movement of boats with species within their ballast water or attached to their hull. So, as a general rule of thumb, the majority of non-native species are beneficial or cause no identifiable harm to the environment. Actually, many of a nation's food sources are actually based on non-native species, such as rice in America. However, some non-native species do cause environmental, social, or economic impacts, and in which case they're known as invasive. So this phenomenon has been occurring for years, a very long time. So, for example, dingoes were introduced into Australia about 6,000 BC through human intervention. So it's one of these events that have been occurring on a regular basis. However, things over recent years, with globalization, increase in the amount of trans-global movement of people and goods, the rate of introduction of non-native species and therefore invasive species has increased over recent years. And actually, the impact that invasive species cause is considered one of the major drivers of global biodiversity loss. So how is it that we can actually manage and try and either slow or even reverse this major environmental issue? So this is a simple invasion model. So if you look at the top part of this, then from a point of origin, so the native range of a species is transported into and introduced into a new area as a result of human activity. And then that species then subsequently becomes established and then increases its range and expansion and starts causing environmental impact. So to try and manage this process, there's key points of intervention along this pathway model that management can take place. And we have within the UK legislative frameworks under which these interventions and management actions can be implemented. So, for example, under the GB non-native species strategy, which really kind of echoes the key components of the Convention for Biological Diversity, where the aim is to try and reduce and, where possible, prevent intentional and unintentional introductions of invasive species from the point of origin along the transport pathway. And to ensure, where possible, that effective contingency responses and capacity are in place to prevent the establishment and by containment of invasive species once they've been introduced, but also to ensure that strategic actions are in place to try and control and, where possible, even eradicate established invasive species once they have actually become established and increased in the expansion range. Obviously, this is an oversimplification there, and also there's a wide range of supporting activities and skills required to really implement such a strategy. So, for example, engagement, risk assessments, public awareness, monitoring, surveillance, data analysis, population modelling, technical expertise and knowledge in relation to specific pathways, biological expertise in relation to species and ecosystem impacts, economists. The list goes on as to the number of skills and amount of expertise actually required to implement these management actions, which makes invasion biology, or more specifically invasion management, by necessity a multidisciplinary approach, or requiring a multidisciplinary approach. Many required skills very specific to a particular invasion management scenario. So really, it's a case of bringing the correct people and skills needed to deal with that particular case together on an ad hoc basis, on a case-by-case basis, which really adds complexity in achieving these goals in relation to management. But one of the advantages of living on an island is that in theory this becomes easier, or at least there's some goals that can be more easily achieved. So I'm going to pass over to Sarah now, and Sarah's going to go through and provide some further insight into how this general model can be looked at in relation to terrestrial invasions, and really what lessons we can learn from other island nations. So Sarah's going to explore some of those points and some successes and lessons learned. So yeah, over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. So starting off with some of the examples in the UK of terrestrial invasive species. So as Paul mentioned, there's quite a few marine and freshwater, and there's some well-known terrestrial ones. So going back to the beginning, I think a lot of people know grey squirrels, obviously American grey squirrels, and American mink. The name gives that one away. But also things like rhododendron, giant hogweed, quite well-known species that have ecological impacts and sometimes health impacts. So the giant hogweed obviously burns your skin. Rhododendron can take over areas and shade out native native vegetation. It's also a suggestion it can alter soil biomes to the disadvantage of native vegetation. Less well known is things that are potentially more restricted in their areas or just been there for a long time. So ringneck parakeets and monk parakeets in London, although they are now spreading, and there's populations elsewhere in the UK. Hedgehogs on islands, particularly around Scotland. So they were sort of introduced as a unintended biocontrol which went wrong, which I'll go into more detail later. One thing that isn't potentially as well known is rats. Because they've been here for so many centuries, it's often thought potentially that they're actually native. They're not in fact native to Europe. So black or ship rats originate from the Indian subcontinent. There's actually a famous temple in India where rats are revered and fed in their droves. It's quite interesting to try and find that on YouTube. Brown or Norway rats don't actually originate from Norway. They came from northern China. It was originally called the Hanover rat, so a bit of a QI fact for you. People wishing to link problems in 18th century England with the House of Hanover decided to name it the Hanover rat, but it got renamed Rattus norvegicus, believing that it migrated to England from Norwegian ships in the 1700s. Similarly, rabbits and brown hares are actually naturalized, so they've been here since Roman times, but they were intentionally brought over by people. So human activities introduced them to the UK. Some of the species which are also an issue here can be an issue elsewhere. So the parakeets I mentioned, they were a major problem in the Seychelles, where they were competing with native species for nesting sites and food, and also carried disease, which could have had a major impact on endangered native species. So a quick sort of plotted history of introductions and where they came from. Some are well known, so Australia and New Zealand is obviously quite well known that some of the species have been brought over. So for example, back in the 1800s, there was acclimatization societies were set up to enable new immigrants, not the penal colony, so willing immigrants, to settle into their new home with familiar species that they could see, hear and hunt. So rabbits, sparrows, blackbirds were all brought over. And then there's also sort of misguided biocontrol. For example, when rabbits were so seen to be coming out of control and cause havoc, stoats were introduced to try and control, but they proceeded to eat everything except their intended prey. So a bit of a double whammy. Cane toads obviously are well known, brought in to control the cane toad beetle, but cause havoc and are poisonous. There's also been some new mistakes. So recently, Tasmanian devils were put into an insurance population on Maria Island in Tasmania, and unfortunately they had more of an impact on the penguins on the island. So lessons haven't been learnt there. In terms of pathways, like as Paul said, these are all human-induced introductions. So rats were brought by seafarers sort of many centuries ago, as I mentioned. Legal and illegal pet and private collection trades has resulted in releases and escapes from private houses. So things like raccoon, which was spotted in Durham a few years ago, and there's been multiple other sightings of raccoons around the UK, more than likely have escaped from or released from private zoos. Horticulture was also intentionally and unintentionally brought species in, such as pondweeds like elodea and diseases like ash dieback, like I said, mostly unintentional. Hedgehogs were introduced to many Scottish islands to combat slugs as a gardener's pest. That was what was thought, and obviously had decimated impact on ground nesting birds and other native ecology. Sometimes introductions are actually accidental. As Paul mentioned, there's been an increase in trade and human movement in the last few centuries. Recently in the news, there was Zippy the farm squirrel arrived in Aberdeen after 3 weeks on a cargo ship from India. Obviously not intended to be put on the ship, managed to stow away, but had arrived. So in terms of the lessons that we can learn from other island nations, I've put this quote here from the Griffin and Alice in Wonderland. I don't think we'd get very far in invasive species management if we follow this advice. I think we need to learn more and more each day, and we need to learn how consider how we can learn from past mistakes and successes from around the world. As an island nation, there's lots of places we can learn from in terms of INNS management, eradication, technology, and ultimately the restoration of ecosystems once INNS have been removed. So lesson one is prevention is better than cure. Prevention is about biosecurity. So this involves sort of identifying potential problem or target species and understanding what species could become an issue and devising legislation to work with this. So this works around sort of pre-border horizon scanning surveys and work that's undertaken in other countries with similar climates or habitats. And species can indicate what is likely to become an invasive species here, and keeping an eye on that and making sure that they don't arrive. So that means that the border sort of detecting known and potential invasive species in goods and people. Australia and New Zealand are well renowned for this border biosecurity. If you've ever seen the Nothing to Declare programme, they do it not just with contraband but also with organic material. This follows on from the horizon scanning to make sure that those that are listed and as potential issue don't get the chance to get in and establish. And then once you get post-border on a country, is where identification expertise, eagle eyes and surveying come in and to result in early detection and rapid response. So for example, in Apem, New Zealand, the Queensland fruit fly was detected and eliminated just by having really tight post-border survey and monitoring. So the diagram that's on this slide on the right hand side shows that the potential pathways of spread of how species can get in. It's quite a detailed diagram, but it gives you an idea of the different ways that invasive species can establish or get into a country. This is all about sort of biosecurity planning and helps you to understand this. The UK has an advantage as an island nation as we have a restricted list of pathways and that we don't have a land border, and because we have that sea border and that geographical border, it can assist us. However, with that vastly increased movement of people and goods, these sort of sea and air borders have become quite fuzzy, so it can make things a little bit more challenging. As islands also generally have a more evolved ecology that's more easily disrupted, as seen in other island nations, there are some lessons we need to learn from this. Our nearest neighbour is only 7 miles over the channel, and this can also allow natural dispersal, so it's understanding the difference between human and natural. So lesson 2, successes in the eye of the beholder. So a recent study looked at 1,550 eradication events which were documented on nearly 1,000 islands since 1872, and it's had a 88% success rate. So that is of 1,227 completed attempts without subsequent reinvasion, over 1,000 of them were successful. 92% of these eradications were invasive mammals and 2% were birds. So mammals are by far the most common species to be eradicated, mostly rodents, rats and mice. And there's lots of examples around the world of rat eradications that have been really successful, from tropics like Seychelles, Caribbean, to subantarctic islands as well. So a whole range of ecosystems and climates. Some of these islands have also been inhabited and some have been very much uninhabited. Cats have also been targeted on Ascension and Macquarie Islands. And other mammals include Indian mongoose for target. In terms of birds, Indian myna have been eradicated from a couple of islands, including the Seychelles. And Reptiles and amphibians are not exempt from this. So green iguanas are under constant rapid response campaign of eradication to protect the native lesser Antillean iguana from the risk of hybridisation and displacement on St. Eustache in the Dutch Caribbean. And during the 45 years that Raoul Island in New Zealand has been undergoing a weed eradication programme, 11 INNS plants have been eradicated, and to complete the restoration of the island's unique ecosystem, which supports significant seabird biodiversity and endemic biota, 9 further weeds must be eradicated, and they are continuing to do this work. To succeed in eradication or even long-term management, excellent planning and management is required prior to even undertaking any of the physical field work on the ground. So it can be a bit of a sort of military operation. As an island, Great Britain is big, but other eradications have been comparatively small, but they are over time been ambitious and increased in scale, and ability to eradicate has increased. Once techniques have been honed and lessons learned, this can be applied and stepped up, which will be something I speak of later. So lesson number 3 is innovation is key. So innovation comes from identifying an issue, and that helps with trying to solve that issue. I think when undertaking invasive species monitoring, management, control and eradication, you need a really wide toolbox of tricks. It can be sort of anything from old tech to new tech, low tech to high tech. So low tech can be as low as greasing a tree to prevent ants getting to a bird's nest, which is one of the pictures on there. There is method in the madness to that. And you've got to think creatively as well. Old tech can be tried and trusted, so traps that have been around for a long time that are humane and as long as they comply with welfare, but they work. And you can have new and high tech stuff, so artificial intelligence or AI is being used in detecting species by machine learning. So this is training computers to detect and label images on thermal imaging cameras, trail cameras, etc. So that you're not having to go through hundreds of thousands of images. You can get computers to tell you which images have species in and which species it is. This is used for endangered species monitoring, can also be applicable to INNS as well. This also has the potential to be done from remote sensing. So the top image shows Japanese knotweeds is visible from an aerial survey done by aircraft. There's lots of techie gadgets that can be used. I don't profess to be a tech person, but you can get automatic sensors which are attached to traps and send you a text or a message when the trap's triggered, so you're not having to check it all the time. And these systems can be interlinked with satellites and networking. You can use remote sensing to look at rhododendron under a tree canopy or in sort of these remote areas that could be quite dangerous for people to go to, using lots of different techniques with cameras. Innovation is also not just about using the professionals, but also trying to get the community and citizen science and using people, which is something else I'll mention in a moment. And I always say that if you've got to know your target. So if you want to catch a squirrel, you've got to think like a squirrel. Adaptive management is quite important as well. You need to be able to adapt and respond to your well thought out plans for when the unthinkable happens, like a global pandemic, or when you're chasing that last animal, trying to find that last weed or that last seed. So following on from innovation, some methods are simply using what's already there and adapting it and honing it. So dogs have been used for a long time for work, so gun dogs, but also sniffer dogs for drugs, and the police for search and rescue. Now they've become more the norm in conservation, so using them to sniff out and find rare species and track, and also can be used to track and find invasive species, animals and plants, terrestrial and submerged aquatic. The more sort of futuristic best friend, if you like, is eDNA, so using molecular techniques to extract minuscule fragments of DNA from soil, air or water and determine the presence of the species in an area. Joe James and James Smith from Apem gave a really great webinar a couple of months ago, which was definitely worth watching. Both techniques are really useful for detection when the INNS is in very low density, such as during the initial stage of incursion or the latter stages of eradication. And both methods are extremely useful for detection and monitoring and prevention, so responding before it becomes an issue. There's a little link on the bottom of this that if you Google it, it's a really interesting story about a dog that saved some penguins. So lesson 5 is teamwork makes the dream work. As Paul mentioned, is very interdisciplinary, and we can't do this as alone. So unless you're working on an uninhabited private island, then involvement and buy-in of the community is crucial. Even then, communities of neighbouring islands may also be considered. So examples are Lord Howe Island off the coast of Australia. Their rat eradication split the community and resulted in a sort of bitter dispute that lasted nearly 20 years. And similar in the Cayman Islands, there's been issues with sort of the discussion around a cat eradication. But if you've got strong buy-in or involvement, and that doesn't mean people having like community doing the work, it's just having them support what you're doing is really crucial. It's also about collaboration. So, okay, it's not an island, but on the border between Austria and the Czech Republic, they successfully managed to eradicate Himalayan balsam off the river. And that was because there was collaboration between governments, national parks and communities on either side of the border. It's multidisciplinary, so it's using social science, microbiology, economists and a whole range of other disciplines to sort of look at the issue and how we can deal with it, and learning from other places, so learning from other countries. There is a study that looks at sort of the scenarios of a sort of percentage of community involvement and the need for sort of what minimum amount of community involvement and land access you'd need for an eradication. But this also applies to any project aiming to sort of control and manage, especially contentious species. So lesson 6 is go large or go home. I think you've got to aim high. South Georgia was the world's largest rat eradication at the time. It was very ambitious but very successful. And currently Stewart Island in New Zealand aims to eradicate all major predators, that's possums, rats, feral cats and hedgehogs. It's touted to be the world's largest eradication, unless you count the mainland mass of North and South Islands of New Zealand, who are currently aiming for predator-free NZ by 2050, which is extremely ambitious but very commendable. It's also looking at it in terms of landscape scale, so looking at it from an ecosystem point of view, but also in terms of mainland islands, which have been very much used in New Zealand. So this can be fenced or unfenced areas which are intensively managed for invasive species for the benefit of native species recovery. I think you've got to dare to dream the impossible and think ambitiously. The next step is looking at multiple species controls and eradication operations in one landscape or location, or for example on one island. So lesson 7 is invasive species denied is restoration or recovery delayed. As mentioned in the last slide, considering tackling multiple invasive species at once is the next step to really restoring ecosystems. Rewilding can have many meanings. Some think of it as a sort of hands-off passive approach, such as what's happened at Chernobyl or Pripyat within the exclusion zone. However, this risks INNS becoming too prevalent in the area. In this particular case, raccoon dogs, of which 9,000 were introduced into the Soviet Union prior to the Chernobyl disaster, sort of risk becoming ecological surrogates unless more active restoration is done. Sometimes native species can help us with this in a sort of slow conservation, if you like. Pine marten recovery has been linked to the demise of grey squirrels to the benefit of red squirrels. It's a sort of win-win-win, if you like. And considering how invasive species management fits into natural capital and biodiversity net gain in the context of restoration is also important. It's probably an entire subject in itself, but in a nutshell, natural capital and biodiversity net gain is still a new concept and still being worked out, but it's increasingly part of legislation and requirements, and it's about looking at the benefits an area provides and mitigating against and adding to any damage. So there's also environmental net gain, which is just sort of biodiversity net gain plus, and looking at sort of whole ecosystems rather than species or habitats. Natural capital is not yet mandatory, but it does need to be considered, and to be able to remove invasive species is a significant help to restoring ecosystems if you're going to be introducing or reintroducing native species or improving what's already there. So some examples within the UK that have been successful: rats. So on the Sheehan Islands in Scotland and the Scilly Isles in England, rats have been eradicated very successfully. Sheehan Islands is uninhabited, the Scilly Islands is inhabited, although a very small population, but still successful. They have still managed to respond rapidly to any potential incursions and remove anything that has reappeared. Other examples that may be a bit less well known is the coypu. In the 1980s, small population was very successfully eradicated before it became an issue. And ruddy duck, almost. There's very few left now, so we're on track for that. Additionally, in terms of not just eradication, but early detection and rapid response, Asian hornet, a nest was recently found in, I think it's Kent, in a garden. So very rapid, came out, removed it, and any sightings have followed up very quickly, which has prevented it becoming a major issue. Outside of the UK's main islands on the overseas territories, as I've mentioned before, South Georgia and Ascension have both had successful eradication and INNS control programs implemented on their islands too. So that was a whistle-stop tour of lessons learned abroad. So in quick summary, invasive species are species that are introduced by human activities to new areas outside of their native range. They become invasive if they start causing issues, and many non-native species can actually be beneficial or have no impact. There's a general framework for invasive species management based on the Convention of Biological Diversity in the UK. And INNS in the UK can vary from the known grey squirrels to the less known monk parakeet, although hopefully you've now learnt a little bit. They can have ecological, economical and health implications, such as the burns that giant hogweed create. There's lots of different instructions and pathways as to how invasive species have got here, although it is predominantly or entirely human-induced activities that have brought them, whether intentional or unintentional. We've had 7 key lessons, so it's looking at biosecurity and prevention, looking at successes elsewhere and learning from that, using innovation and technology, looking at assistance in terms of our four-legged friends and DNA, and collaborating with other disciplines and local communities. It's about being really ambitious and aiming high, and then looking at the bigger picture of where invasive species management fits into restoration of sites. INNS are one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss and have impacts with climate change, so I think their management is really important for our ecosystems. Just for anyone that's quite technical, we've included some of the references, which will obviously be on the recording, so you can go and have a read of some of the information, and there is links on some of the slides for some of the news reports and websites that I've included as well. Okay, thank you very much, and if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat, and myself and Paul will answer them as best we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, really, really interesting. So does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask us about the content of the presentation today? Okay, I think we may be question free. Okay, but if anybody does have any questions, then please do not hesitate to email either myself or Sarah, or there is also on the Apem website a general, oh, sorry, questions has come in. Okay, actually quite a few questions coming in now. So you referred to biodiversity net gain in the relationship with INNS. Are there any lessons to be learned from other islands that have any similar model of unit creation? Sarah, are you aware of?
No, I'm not. It's something I would have to look into. I'm not aware of anything specific off the top of my head.
Yeah. Okay. What I would do is maybe we'll talk to our natural capital team within Apem and come back to you. At the moment, you've got it's an anonymous attendee who's asked that question, so I don't know if you want to link your either email address, or what we can do is try and answer the question in the general email that's sent around with the attachment of the presentation. That most probably be a better way of doing it, actually. So yeah, we will take note of that question and make sure we answer it with the general email that goes around. Okay, so next question from Sarah. Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. You're very welcome. I'm curious about when you take action on a conflict generating species. For example, in many countries, cats are considered invasive, but I cannot imagine an eradication program going on in this country anytime soon. That's a really interesting one about conflicting species. Obviously, the thing is that cats being companion pets. There's also other examples where species that have economic value are also viewed as generating conflict if other people want to eradicate them from a environmental perspective. And I think that this is really where engagement with the community is really important. I think from a cat's perspective, they tend to be feral populations that tend to be more controlled, and the domestic element of the cat population is managed separately. So, for example, they're neutered or kept separate. I mean, Sarah, I don't know if you've got anything else to add to that.
Yeah, there is actually quite a widespread program of trap, neuter, return with feral cats in the UK, particularly around areas that have Scottish wildcats, which is obviously quite location specific. But I think across the UK, it's not necessarily an eradication; it's a very slow version to do that. You're not going to go in one hit, get rid of them, but it does prevent them from breeding. And as Paul mentioned, it is quite a conflict generating subject, but I think to take that action you really do need to take steps to involve people and explain the reasoning behind what you're doing, and just have that kind of multidisciplinary approach to the work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Moving on to the next question. We've actually had some great success with biological control for Himalayan balsam and Japanese knotweed on the teas. I think that biocontrol can be a great tool if tested extensively before being released. Do you know if previous biological control was tested before being released? I completely agree that I think as long as there's that thorough testing of biological control agents before being released, then yeah, it can be a fantastic tool. But it's always that that unknown of what could potentially happen to a biological control agent, and that kind of depends on generation time, for example, of how it could potentially mutate. So yeah, there's an awful lot of testing that does need to be required, and I think that some of the stuff that Cabby's been doing recently with many others on various plant control biocontrol agents is absolutely amazing. And yeah, I do think that as long as it is thoroughly tested and examined, then it is a really powerful tool to have in the toolbox. I don't believe that maybe some of the other previous spider control agents were tested as thoroughly as maybe they are now. And Sarah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good lesson that many people have learned is, you know, after the likes of the cane toad and the stoats in the Antipodes, is definitely do your testing very, very, very thoroughly. And that's potentially what wasn't done then, but is done now.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, last question, and I think that this may need a bit more textualization before we can actually answer it thoroughly, but it says, thank you very much. When there is a large stand of Japanese knotweed directly adjacent to a river body, what is the best management approach to control it while preserving water quality and ecosystems? I think that's a really good question, and I think it's most probably one that requires more of a written response than a verbal one. There's quite a number of different methods that can actually be used to control Japanese knotweed. So I think that maybe it might be best if we actually provide a written response to that within the email that we'll send around on the 19th with the recording, link to the recording of this. So I hope you don't mind waiting for a response until then. Okay, so next question. In your experience, what's the most effective way to get community buy-in of invasive non-native species management projects? In my experience, make it personal. So actually make sure that you try and find that hook that makes engages the community and makes them appreciate and understand why really the management of the invasive species that you're trying to look at is really important to them as individuals, but also as a community. So I think that it's finding that link, the thing that really does make them appreciate or encourage them to appreciate, I should say, why it is important that the invasive species is actually managed. So yeah, it's I don't know, winning hearts and minds, I suppose, to coin a phrase. And Sarah, I don't know if you've got anything else to add to that.
No, absolutely the same. Just it's making it personal and making the people see the benefits and having a benefit to the community, to the work that you're doing in some way, shape or form. I'm just going in slowly, just speaking to people, making it personal, as Paul said.
Yeah, it's also, I suppose, being honest and realistic about these things, you know, and it not, although despite the great success rates that actually Sarah highlighted within the presentation for management, especially on some island states, I think being realistic with people about you know, how long certain things may take, and you know, and being very clear in relation to end goals. So yeah, I think that there's it's transparency as well as making it personal, really. So I think that's it as far as the questions we received so far. I mean, like I said, if you do have any further questions that you'd like to ask us that you think of afterwards, or after possibly, you know, seeing the presentation again, then yeah, please do let us know. As I said at the beginning, if there's any particular topics you would like us to cover, then, you know, again, please let us know, and we'll try and see if we can set up a webinar to try and cover that. I will ensure that there is a response to the biodiversity net gain question that in the email going out, and also for the I'll provide a bit more of a written explanation about Japanese knotweed management as well within the email that goes around. So I think that's it for questions, unless anybody's got any last ones. If not, I think I'll say thank you ever so much to everybody for attending, and it's always a really great pleasure to provide these webinars, and you know, we really like sharing our knowledge and expertise, and also, you know, we feel that it's, you know, giving back to the wider invasive species community. So yeah, thank you ever so much for everybody attending, and yeah, I hope to see you again all in the near future. Thank you very much.